Day by Jaga Jagast here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. The Chicano political and civil rights activist Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez has died. He died on Tuesday at home in Denver, Colorado. He was 76. Gonzalez was an iconic leader in the movement for justice and equality for Mexican Americans in the Southwest. He's credited with raising the nation's awareness of the plight of urban Chicanos. In the mid-1960s, he founded an urban civil rights and cultural movement called the Crusade for Justice, which advocated Chicano nationalism. During the late 60s and early 70s, he organized walkouts, demonstrations against police brutality, and marches against the Vietnam War.
In 1968, Gonzalez led a Chicano contingent to the Poor People's March on Washington, D.C., and issued a Plan of the Barrio, which demanded better housing, education, and restitution of Pueblo lands. Gonzalez was also an organizer of the annual Chicano Youth Liberation Conference, which sought to create unity among Chicano youth. He also advocated for increased political representation for Chicanos. In 1972, he was the keynote speaker at the newly formed La Raza Unida Party National Convention in El Paso, Texas. The party fielded political candidates to run for office in the state. But perhaps Gonzalez is best known for his poem, I Am Joaquin, Yo Soy Joaquin. He wrote the epic poem in 1965, and it is one of the most important literary works to emerge from the Chicano movement. In the poem, he tells of the historic struggles faced by Mexican Americans in the United States.
Joining us on the phone right now from Minnesota to talk about the life and legacy of Corky Gonzalez is writer and columnist Roberto Rodriguez. We welcome you to Democracy Now!
Yes, good morning, Amy and Juan.
It's good to have you with us. Can you talk about your friend, colleague, Corky Gonzalez?
Yeah, like any mythic hero, it's kind of hard initially because we're still in the shock and the mourning. You know, I don't think he's buried until Sunday. So, I mean, keeping that in mind, you know, as I think about Corky, you know, I guess there's words that swirl around the I Am Joaquin. You know, I think for a lot of us, we look at it probably as a manifesto, you know, because, I mean, you could also look at it as a poem or something literary, but at the same time, it was also a manifesto, but not like political only, but almost a spiritual manifesto, because I think that poem that Juan mentioned, you know, it talked about how, you know, all of us, we all used to call each other different names, like Mexicano, Latino, Chicano, all these different names, and everybody be fighting about it, you know, and I think that poem was an attempt to unify a people. Now, you know, the unity maybe was more, an illusion, perhaps, but at another level, you know, I think people felt unified and felt good about that poem. It was no longer, you know, in the streets there was like people called each other wetbacks and mojados and pochos. You know, that was derisiveness, and this was the opposite. You know, it was an attempt to say, you know, we're one people. And there's another thing that I should mention too about who he was, because I think civil rights would probably not be sufficient in terms of a leader. I think Juan, of course, would know this firsthand. You know, I think it was the language of liberation. And so when people spoke of movement in those days, you know, that we were talking about movements around the world, you know, liberation movements. And he was critical in principle in that idea of, in this instance, Aztlán, you know, as something to liberate. You know, through the years, of course, that has become something different, more, of course, civil rights or human rights. But at the time, it was like, you know, hey, you know, why are we being chased out of our ancestral homes? That was the language of the time.
And could you talk a little bit about the Crusade for Justice and its impact on Chicano youth and youth all around the country at that time, and then the rise of Raza Unida and Corky's role in that? Sure.
I think, you know, the Crusade for Justice is, when I was thinking about it, I was saying, you know, I think I had talked earlier about like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. You know, they represented something very special for us as a people, you know, and we could probably see them as perhaps the heart, you know. He was the fist, you know, that is the Crusade for Justice, stood for defiance, resistance. So, in other words, rather than get into specificities, of the role, the specific role of the crusade, I think in a bigger sense we can look at it like that's what the crusade was. That's what it meant to us as a people, that we were no longer going to, sit or stand or kneel with our heads bowed and, si patron or si señor. I think the crusade gave us that, that impetus, that again, that hey, we're not going to take it. And I think that's what I think we can learn or remember the crusade for. The crusade evolved later into Escuela Tlatelolco, but the earlier era that you're referring to also is the Raza Unida Party. Again, very turbulent era, but again, it was also in that context of things, liberatory things, ideas. And I think the Raza Unida Party at that time meant a breaking from the democratic stranglehold of, the Republicans that wanted nothing to do with us, and the Democrats took us for granted. And so La Raza Unida Party was supposed to be that alternative. Now, as you well know, you had these intelligence operations that were heavy duty, fighting, pitting people against each other, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it effectively destroyed not just the Raza Unida Party, but many movements throughout the world, in this country in particular. So, that's why, again, we can look at his biography and his obituary and see all the accomplishments and controversies and all these things, but in the end, I think he will be seen as a mythic hero, as somebody who, stood up. And, when I say fist, in a sense, it's literal. He was a boxer, and I think it's the idea was like, yes, we can fight back.
What had he been doing in his later years? Clearly, after the high tide of the movement in the 70s began to ebb, what was he involved in his later years?
Well, one thing that's really important to note is that at that time and a little later, also critical work was the relations between the Crusade and Chicano movement with the American Indian movement. That's something that many people don't know. And you well know, of course, the relations between Chicanos, Puerto Ricans, Chicanos, and other peoples. But one thing that people didn't know, perhaps, is the relationship between Chicanos and AIM, which I think at the time the FBI considered that the greatest threat to national security. The whole idea that Chicanos might one day see themselves as being native. And one thing, his history is too long to detail, except that something that many people should know, perhaps. Because in the last, I would say, 15 years or so, he had a heart attack, and he crashed, and he was never the same. I remember my wife and I, Patricia, we went to Tlatelolco, presented, and we saw him and met him again, and he was no longer the same person from an earlier era. And so what I want to mention this is because this generation probably will only remember, a señor, this great man who, barely was able to move around, so to speak, and not know the impact he had, in the 50s as a boxer, as a leader, 60s, 70s. He was an incredible man. And in the last 15 years, he was slowed, so to speak, by those injuries. But so powerful was his effect from that early era that he, I think, will live on always, as Cesar Chavez will live on, and the people remain alive because their ideas will remain alive.
We're talking to Roberto Rodriguez. What about Corky Gonzalez suing the Rocky Mountain News in February of 1974, a $30 million libel suit, because of what he felt was their inaccurate representation of people in Crusade? Yeah.
Well, I could only characterize that as part of the same era where, and I'm almost hesitating to laugh because you probably know this full well, to this day, that is the principal battle of not simply Chicano movements, but people of color as well, indigenous movements. Every single day we are mischaracterized, we are censored, and on a good day, we're misrepresented. And that was part of that era. Part of the same era, of course, is the whole struggle with Coors. That was, again, this is another generation, but the struggle with media is, God, it's really tragic, maybe tragicomic, but it's never ending. It's not limited. That's why when people look at Corky, they're not looking at Corky in Denver or Corky in the Crusade, but this is emblematic of the entire nation. I mean, as your colleagues of ours, whenever we go anywhere, that's probably the number one complaint, that the media is misrepresenting us. They're forcing an identity upon us. They're commercializing us. In his case, of course, you were dealing with other matters and other factors. Obviously, all the intelligence stuff. God, I mean, no, I don't know. It's almost like I'm looking into a mirror into the future. Now we have the government buying media, manufacturing stories. So it's I don't know. It's kind of weird, that media always seems to be the spear, of anti-progressive movements, anti-indigenous, anti-Chicano, Puerto Rican, all these movements. The media is always there at the forefront. I don't know if whatever happened to the lawsuit. If he won, he may have. I remember Bert Corona in L.A. won a lawsuit. There was always lawsuits everywhere, and there'd probably be too many if people really. I don't know. I think people sometimes get cynical about the media and just give up on it.
Well, Roberto Rodriguez, we want to thank you very much for being with us as we remember Corky Gonzalez, who died at his home in Denver, Colorado this week. Thank you. And that wraps up our coverage. Monday, Juan will be joined by Elena Poniatowska, leading Mexican journalist.
Yes, and we'll look at some of the enormous changes occurring in Mexico right now, and the citizen uprising over the government's attempt to indict one of the leading presidential candidates.
Also look at the killing of Mexican journalists, especially covering the drug war and issues along the border. And that's going to be on Monday here on Democracy Now! Today, the Unimed the Media Tour heads to Baltimore for the National Federation of Community Broadcasters Conference at noon. And then at 3, we'll be at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health tonight at the Unity United Methodist Church at 7:30 p.m. in Baltimore. Tomorrow, Saturday, Albuquerque at noon at UNM, University of New Mexico Student Union Ballroom as we celebrate KUNM. In the evening in Santa Fe, St. John's College Gym with the Nobel Peace Prize winner and East Timor's foreign minister, José Ramos Horta. On Sunday, we'll be in Taos, New Mexico at Bataan Hall, Civic Plaza Drive. And on Sunday night at 7 p.m., the Reading Room in Las Vegas. You can get more information at our website at democracynow.org. And that does it for today's broadcast. The show is produced by a remarkable team of people. Mike Burke, Sharif Abdel-Qaddus, John Hamilton, Ana Noguera, Elizabeth Press, Yoruba Richin, Jeremy Scahill. Mike DeFilippo and Ryan Abernathy are engineers. Special thanks to Uri Gallet, our director, our technical director, Angela Alston, Chris Zucker, and the whole team that makes this broadcast possible. Also thanks to Dennis Moynihan, Karen Renucci, Jenny Filipazzo. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.